So you've heard the buzz about podcasts and you're intrigued. You want to play an episode in class, but you wonder, what would that even look like? What would kids do while they're listening? What would they do after they listen? Which show would be best? How would it fit into everything else you're up to? Yeah, I hear you. It's a whole new genre, and you might just be the first teacher on your hall to use it. A few easy wins to help you get started sure wouldn't hurt. So today on the podcast, I want to help you get started with podcasts. I know they can be a great resource for learning because here you are listening to one. So let's talk about how you can try one out in class as soon as possible. Hey there, I'm your host, Betsy Potash, and one-pagers, project-based learning, and choice reading are my jam. I believe in you, and my goal is to help you explore all the creative possibilities you dream of for your classroom. I'm an educator, a chocolate cake aficionado, a traveler who can't wait to get back to Barcelona, and the kind of mom who brings her own mini maker space to her kid's classroom when she comes to volunteer. I know this for sure, creativity isn't always easy. As a creative teacher, you get parent calls you treasure, and plenty of sidelong comments you'd rather forget. But here's the bottom line. Creative education can ignite a spark in your students and change their lives forever. You and I know this. You're an innovator, and while it's sometimes hard, it's so worth it. So let's explore the world of creative education together. Welcome to the Spark Creativity Teacher Podcast. Okay, one of the very first strategies that I'm going to suggest is that you play a podcast episode for your students and have them practice taking sketch notes. When you want to help students work on their listening skills and their critical thinking skills at the same time, this is a wonderful activity. It can be a 5-minute, 10-minute, 20-minute activity. You queue up an episode that you think they'll love. You let them choose a sketch notes template, and I have some linked in the show notes, some wonderful free downloads. And then you play the episode and you let them practice this skill. Sketch notes help them to take the information that they're hearing and divide out what's not that important from what is. They have to use those critical thinking skills to structure the information on the page. So instead of just writing down bullet points of every single thing that they hear, they're going to use different containers like little bubbles and boxes, different lettering styles. They're going to put some things big and bold and some things small in regular writing. They're going to draw in little icons to help them kind of find key things on the page and draw connectors like arrows and dashes and dotted lines that help them show which parts of what they're writing connect to which other parts of their writing. When students take sketch notes, they not only have this chance to process the information in a more critical way and decide for themselves what's crucial to remember, but they actually make it easier to remember that information because they're using the two sides of their brain, the image processing and the verbal processing. They are lighting up all these internal dots in their mind, and they're going to make it easier to remember things. So this is just a fun way to expose them to podcasts, to maybe play something that you think would be interesting to them, and then have them practice this skill. There are 2 episodes of this podcast you might want to tune into if you're really intrigued and sketch notes are new to you. Way back in episode 46, I interviewed Mike Rohde, who's the inventor of sketch notes. And then a few years later, in episode 140, I interviewed Sylvia Duckworth, who's been pioneering them in educational contexts for a really long time. So I'm going to recommend those 2 shows. If you're hearing this and thinking, wow, sketch notes, I want to get started with that, and I want to know more, go back and check those out. Okay, next let's talk about playing a single episode and using it as a prompt. There are so many ways you could do this. Let's say you're working on argument. You could play a podcast episode that takes a position on anything, something that students are interested in. And then you can invite students to attack that position and argue for the other side in a written piece. Maybe you're working on script writing. You could play a dramatic episode that leaves the story hanging. This is really common. Podcast episodes that are fiction often end on a cliffhanger. So you could play a short episode and then invite students to write the next piece of the show, to use their creativity to design the next episode. Maybe you're working on personal essays. You could play an episode that shares a personal story in a unique way. The show This American Life comes to mind on this. There's so many different kinds of personal stories on that show. Then you can invite students how they might share a personal story from a similar angle or with a similar twist, or maybe just that story makes them think of a story in their own life and you want to do some writing based on their own personal reflections. Maybe you're working on research. You could play an episode that brings in an expert as a guest on the show and have students listen. And maybe you want to have them imagine a perspective that's missing in the show or a bias that they feel is being held in the show. And then they can do some research and present an alternative side or come up with another expert that they wish would come on to that show to share a different take on the issue. So let's walk through 2 quick, really specific examples of how you might play a podcast episode in class as a prompt. These both happen to be perfect for middle school. There are some really amazing short podcasts out there for middle school. Smash Boom Best is one of my favorites. It's a beautifully produced, fun debate show. I've talked about it on here before. It's perfect for helping students see the possibility of arguing 2 different sides of an issue, not to mention addressing counter arguments. So one of my favorite episodes, the one that just had me laughing so hard, is called Baths versus Showers, and is likely to elicit really strong reactions from your students. You could play this show, Baths versus Showers, and then at the end, you could ask them to write their own opinion, which is better, baths or showers. And after having heard the show, they're going to hear how the contestants on the show provide so many examples and anecdotes and funny ways of playing on the audience's emotion as they are arguing for their side. So you can invite students to use some of those same techniques. Another example, totally different, would be to play the very first episode of the show, The Unexplainable Disappearance of Mars Patel. This is a serial mystery show with short shows. They all end, like I was saying before, on a huge cliffhanger, making students want to keep going. So maybe you play episode 1 and then you invite your students to write their own script that would forward the plot in episode 2. They could write in teams, in pairs, or they could write alone. Okay, moving on, another way of integrating podcasts for the first time in class. If you don't really have time in your main class curriculum right now, but you just want to start to get students excited about podcasts and get them interested, you could feature podcasts on an interactive bulletin board. So I've talked before about QR codes. I'm really a big fan. They make it so easy to integrate the sort of world of technology with the physical world. So QR codes would be perfect on an interactive bulletin board about podcasting. You can throw up QR codes to maybe 3 shows or 3 specific episodes that you think are really great and include kind of a little teaser, make a poster for each one and then the QR code and put it up on your bulletin board or in your hallway. And it just becomes something that's kind of piquing students' interest when they walk by. What is this QR code? What is this picture of a person with headphones? What is this? This sounds interesting. The other thing you can do with that display or bulletin board once you have it up is point early finishers over to it. If you have a student finish something 15 minutes early, or they're just, 3 chapters ahead of everybody in the reading or whatever, I know you can point them over to the early finishers bulletin board, this podcast bulletin board, and say, hey, why don't you pick out an episode of Smash Boom Best that you think sounds funny and listen for a little bit? Or why don't you check out the next episode of Mars Patel? I wonder what's going to happen when they get to the island or whatever. And then you're just kind of generating interest that you can come back to later with something more in depth, maybe one of these other strategies. Okay, next I want to talk about playing a podcast episode almost as a lesson, a podcast episode that's going to provide your students with helpful information that they need. Now, I love this one because it's such an easy way to dip your toes into the world of podcasts. Let me give you a couple of examples. Maybe there's a grammatical concept that you want to review, and instead of creating a mini lesson yourself, you wouldn't mind having somebody else already have made something amazing about this topic for you. Grammar Girl is a podcast that I just find hilarious, witty, well-researched. There are so many shows there on different grammatical concepts that people struggle with, adults struggle with, kids struggle with. For example, there's an 8-minute show on active versus passive voice. And I mean, in what English classroom are we not reviewing active versus passive voice? It just sort of always seems to come up. If you want to review this concept with your students, you can play this 8-minute episode with all these great examples from essentially a professional grammarian who is teaching this to the world on her show. And give them a little sketch notes handout so they can jot down some of the examples, some of the rules relating to active versus passive voice, and boom, your lesson is taught. Another example would be the workshop that I put out on this show last year about the college essay. In episode 160 of this show, we heard from 4 different experts on writing college essays, 2 expert college guidance counselors, 2 expert experienced university admissions officers, and each one in a few minutes gave students their absolute best advice for writing a great college essay. So it's getting to be fall, right? If you're listening to this live, play that episode for your students and have them take some notes on the very best wisdom from 4 experts in the field on how to write a great college essay. And boom, you have your lesson. There are so many podcasts about so many things. So I really encourage you, if you feel like a short workshop from experts on some kind of different topic that you're going to be teaching would be helpful, you could search for that in your podcast app, in a podcast directory, or just search it on Google, but include the word podcast in your search terms. Another easy inroad to introducing a podcast for the first time would be to play an episode that brings in some, I don't want to say wisdom, play an episode that brings in some context about the author or is an interview with that author. And it could be wisdom, or it could be something funny, or it could be like a unique take on their own work, whatever it is. If you're looking to help students get to know an author a little better and provide some context about that author, podcast episodes can be a really great option for that. And one of my favorite examples would be the Folger Library's podcast, Shakespeare Unlimited. This is an incredible resource. I mean, the Folger Library, and it has over 200 different episodes coming at Shakespeare from different perspectives. Some of my favorite episodes are called Hip Hop and Shakespeare and Pop Sonnets. And these are just 2 episodes that help make connections between the life of William Shakespeare and the work of William Shakespeare and things that are going on today that might feel really relevant and even fun or funny to students. But there are so many different options. You could go from a much more academic angle, depending on the age of your students and the interests of your students, or you can focus on some of the shows that kind of connect with modern culture and pop culture. A quick Google search, again, is going to turn up an author interview or a show that discusses the work and the author for so many contemporary authors. I just did a quick search, for example, of Trevor Noah, and I think I put in like Trevor Noah memoir podcast. And I immediately turned up an episode from A Little Happier with Gretchen Rubin that's about that book that I've actually already listened to and liked, so I know I can recommend it. But yeah, on the very first page of search results, I got this 2.5-minute show from Gretchen Rubin. Her show is called A Little Happier, and it's all about these like small steps you can take to be happier in your life. And in this 2.5-minute episode, she talks about Trevor's line in the book where he says, "You can only dream of what you can imagine." And she just kind of reflects on it a little bit. This is something you could play while teaching Trevor Noah as a writing prompt, or you could play it before you introduce the book, sort of like as an anticipatory activity. But like I say, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You could put in any contemporary author and probably find 5 or 6 interviews that they've done on different podcasts or different podcasters that are reflecting on their work. And you could find a piece that would lead to a debate or a discussion or a writing prompt. Another example, last one of this idea of playing podcast to introduce an author. If you look at last week's episode on this show, it's an interview with Jerry Craft designed to be played for students. And there you're going to have 20 minutes from an incredibly famous graphic novelist talking about how he got into being a graphic novelist, what comics he liked, how he started drawing, how why he chose the topics he talked about, how he connected it to his own life. You could play 5 minutes of that when introducing any graphic novel. And if you're introducing Jerry Craft or doing a First Chapter Friday about one of his books, again, playing an excerpt of that is a great way to introduce him. Okay, last but not least, and this is where we would take it, we would start to be bridging into a more advanced level. Don't be nervous. I know you've got this. You could play a podcast episode and use it as a mentor text. And this is where you start to go beyond just listening to a podcast and you start to get students thinking like podcasters. So in this case, you would probably want to have a little more time than just like 20 or 30 minutes in class. When students start to think about podcasts as podcasters, then they're not just thinking about the content of the show. You're also going to have them start to notice, how is this show structured? What is the point of this show? What is this show really trying to accomplish in the world? How is this podcaster using interviews, using suspense? Is there bias in this show? How are they crafting their show with music and sound clips and mixing together different quotes or different interviews? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? When you turn it like this and have students start to think about the structure, it provides a fantastic jumping off point for any kind of student podcasting project, whether it's a tiny project. You have students listen to 2 shows as mentor texts, and then you have them write a 1-minute podcast and record it. Or whether it becomes a whole project-based learning in your class where they're going to learn about research, interviewing, editing, recording, cover design, bias, perspective, and more. If this pedagogy lane is one that you feel excited about, I'm not going to go really deeply into it now, but I have already designed a mini course that walks you through it step by step. It's totally free. It's called Camp Creative, the Easy Roadmap to Student Podcasting. And I did it with about 5,000 teachers last year. And then from that live kind of run through that we did together, which was so much fun, I created a version you can just take anytime. So I will put the link to that in the show notes. If this feels something you're really excited about and you want to get going with student podcasting as well as having students listen to podcasts, you can easily run through that course and have your students podcasting next week. Okay, my friend, that's probably enough strategies for one day. I hope you found a first step into the wide world of classroom podcasts that you feel excited about. Once you get started, I think you're going to be amazed at all that's waiting out there in the podcast world for your students. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about all things podcast. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay creative.